Many of you have heard me say in the past that the government markets fear the same way as Procter and Gamble markets soap and other sundries. It's really interesting to see how this has developed and how much hasn't changed over the last half century. When I first started out practicing, after I came back from Chicago, there was a Lawyers Guild convention in Boulder that next year. I attended and met many of the people I worked with in Chicago and new people that I'd worked with here in Colorado. And it was quite the affair. It was one of the larger ones. It was held at the CU Law School. And there was a lot of controversy too, because there was a whole group of people that wanted the paralegals and the other people to have a voice in voting and management of the guild. Many of us felt that we were the ones that had licenses at risk rather than the paralegals, and it was a lot more at stake for us than to be foot soldiers in some of the causes. We lost. But one of the real interesting things about the convention is I got to meet a lot of the people I'd talked to on the telephone and worked with over the years. One was Gary in San Francisco. He was representing the Black Panthers at that time. I also met Jess Alceda, who represented Corky Gonzalez, Charlie Vigil, who had the Crusade for Freedom, and started the MALDEF program. And lots of other people. At that time, the Chicago 7 trial had just completed, and I had the fortunate experience of being able to compare notes about political cases and political activism with both Bill Quinzler, and Lenny Weinglass. We had dinner at the Red Lion Inn in Boulder and discussed a lot of what was going on politically, tactically, things like that. One of the big advantages I had was being in Chicago while a lot of this stuff was going on. And particularly since the Chicago Convention was the locus of much controversy, where it showed a police riot knocking the shit out of protesters, anti-Vietnam War to protesters, particularly at Grant Park. All of this was discussed at this convention, and it was very informative. It was probably the best convention I ever went to. Well, one of the things that occurred in that era is defense attorneys were not considered the enemy. I worked on a committee with a U.S. attorney named Milton Branch, and we were on the criminal bar exam committee. We drafted the criminal law questions and graded them. And we worked together quite well. In fact, one of the questions we had was a case that he and I were opposed to each other, and we asked the bar candidates how they would rule in that case. And it was very helpful to us, plus it was also helpful to the bar candidates to see how they'd answer that question, because it hinged around the area of intent. And intent was in question at that time because we were going from a civil law system, a common law system, to a Napoleonic civil law system. And intent became a matter of general intent and not specific intent. Well, in any event, a little while later, I spent a lot of time studying various police harassment and federal harassment instances, such as the Operation Chaos of the CIA, Minaret of the NRA, and also Garden Plot of military intelligence, and the COINTEL program of the FBI. They all had their little counter-espionage programs, and they were quite active then because the Nixon administration didn't think that the students, the young people, had enough brains to organize and actively be against the war and protest the war and organize against it. Therefore, we had to have been sponsored by communists and funded by communists. And that was the assumption of all the intelligence services. And they were looking for evidence of communist backing, sort of like the Philbrick days of the FBI, I Led 3 Lives. But it didn't really exist that way. What they didn't realize was it was more an ideological thing among young people rather than a foreign interference. One of the drivers of that was the drug laws that the older intelligence people figured was corrupting our society and corrupting our youth, etc. Secondly, one of the federal agencies were using drug sales to fund various operations, and they didn't want this to become general knowledge. So there was a lot of internecine politics going on. In any event, I was just reviewing an article in the Chicago Sun-Times about a Black Panther raid on two Black Panthers, Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. Here's the article that I clipped. Now, this happened in 1969 and was very, very scandalous. The Chicago Police Department and Special Unit of the Prosecutor's Office led a raid on the Panther headquarters, or an apartment inhabited or lived in by Hampton and his partner there, Mark Clark. The the raid resulted in a couple deaths and more injuries. The cops came in shooting, and of course Hampton got shot in the process and died. So when there was an investigation of police brutality and misconduct, the real problem that occurred was that they had evidence of the incident, and the cops claimed that Hampton fired through the door and they returned fire. Well, of course, the U.S. Attorney's Office and investigators wanted to see the door, but somehow it got lost. When they did finally find it, there were 50 bullet holes going into the door and none coming out. But the case was over by that time. The investigation of the state's police and the Panther raid was run out of Denver by a friend of mine named Milton Branch, who was head of the criminal defense or criminal bar question and head of my committee there, and a very, very capable, famous U.S. attorney. Now, Milton knew that I'd represented radical groups and various people like that, and he also knew I had access to him. So we went out for drinks one afternoon, and he said, "Dennis, I need your help." I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, you read about the Chicago raid and the Hampton raid." And I said, "Oh, yeah. And he said, "Well, I'm in charge of the investigation there." And I said, "Well, what have you found so far?" And he says, "What I really believe is it was a search and destroy mission by the Illinois State's Attorney, Hanrahan, to go out hunting for black radicals. But I can't really prove it. I can't get enough testimony to make that stick. and I want some Panthers to appear in front of my grand jury and testify to the structure of the Panthers and what was going on at the time, and maybe give some information about what their informers told them about the Hanrahan raid. Well, I said, I'll try, Milt, but I don't know whether they want to do that politically. You had that, and you had the whole world is watching thing with the Democratic Convention, and I don't know politically whether the Panthers would like to share the blame with the government or not, but I'll try. Well, after several conversations with Gary, it became obvious that he would not recommend any of the Panthers cooperate with the grand jury. At that point, there was no way of indicting the Illinois State's Attorney, or Chicago State's Attorney, on charges of anything conspiratorial regarding the Panther raid. There was no public announcement of it being a search and destroy mission by the state's police, and there was any outcry whatsoever to turn over the door and turn over the evidence. And it was sort of like a conspiracy of silence. The FBI and the state's attorney and the organized crime strike force and all those people thought they were better than God and they could make the rules, and because they had God on their side and they're going after bad guys, there was no limitation whatsoever, which was against the tread of the law at that time, because that's when you had Gideon versus Wainwright, which afforded indigent representation in court. You had the Miranda and Escobedo cases talking about rights for information of charges, right to representation, etc. And all of that stuff was going on. But the law enforcement establishment fought tooth and nail over all of that. They had no intent of claiming any of the police brutality actions or acts were that of police brutality. They were just doing their jobs. And the problem was the public and prosecutors and defense attorneys particularly were tying their hands behind their back. They worked their asses off going out and getting criminals, and what happened? They got a slap on the wrist and they were turned loose. It showed at that point that the propaganda machine of the prosecutors and the police was very powerful, where they could totally negate the Constitution in the minds of the public and get the public on their side, where believing in the Constitution and following the Constitution was equivalent of heresy and thwarting law enforcement and not being for law and order. Because if you're for law and order, you have to support the local police, no matter how bad or reprehensible their conduct may be. So that was the milieu around 1968, 69, 70. Well, a report finally came out through Freedom of Information actions and things like this just recently, that was published in the Chicago Sun-Times, who, by the way, published the law school newspaper that I edited and have been very close to ever since. So what they found, it was that they had new light shed on the Panther raid in Chicago's West Side on December 1969. And they had covered, through FBI records, a lot of evidence of how long African Americans have been demanding fair treatment from the law and not getting it. So what essentially happened is that Milt Branch was partially right, that the chain of command went up to the state's attorney in Illinois, from Cook County, a guy named Hanrahan. But also the article says new records reveal complicity in the raid ran higher up the ladder at the FBI than previously assumed or confirmed. And the full story still is a secret, but released records show of some complicity. The police that winter morning arrived with a search warrant after a gun battle between the police and the Panthers the month before. They fired a barrage of more than 50 or 90 bullets, it says here, into the door of the premises, and they went in and mopped it up, and Hampton and a few others were dead. The rest of the people were routed up and arrested. An investigation into the raid, and that must have been Milton Branch's investigation, showed that the FBI coordinated assassination attempts as part of an illegal covert program called COINTEL Pro. There's a couple books that I had. One was the Glass House Tapes about the police in Los Angeles and the various COINTEL programs. The other thing is when I got involved in the Tannenbaum-Ria affair, COINTEL figured prominently into that. In fact, one time I came out to my car in Boulder, and there were some COINTEL agents and a few police officers crawling around in my Chrysler Imperial through the sunroof. And when I confronted them, they didn't expect me to come out that early. I asked what they were doing. They said, well, they had rumors that there was maybe a bomb planted in front of the courthouse, so they had to search my car for the bomb. Under the guise of protecting me, of course. Well, what came out in the earlier investigation of the Panther raid was that the supposed bullet holes coming out of the apartment were nothing but nail heads, according to the police's own photographers. So they charged 7 Panthers with attempted murder, which were later dropped, and the cases went on. Now, as part of the investigation revealed recently was that an FBI coordinated assassination was part of an illegal program called COINTEL Pro. We suspected an assassination, and Milton Branch, the U.S. attorney from Colorado, was convinced it was an assassination and called it a search and destroy mission. It showed that the Panthers had been in the FBI sights, and since the blacks were complaining that there was discrimination and mistreatment of blacks, discrimination against jobs and housing, our great liberal leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who maintained there is no such thing as a mafia, got pissed off. And according to the documents recovered in '71, Hoover wanted to disrupt and misdirect, otherwise neutralize African American organizations. And according to the FBI Select Committee on Intelligence, they set about to destroy the Black Panther Party. Additionally, other information came out about a personal attack against Martin Luther King and a slander attack and things like that, which were also, I think, part of this. Reports recently released through Freedom of Information Act showed that Sullivan, director of the FBI, Domestic Intelligence Division, and Moore, head of the extremist section of the FBI Intelligence Division, played a key role in this incident. Now, I ran across Sullivan and these people earlier in the reports that I received from the FBI on the Tannenbaum-Ria affair. Sullivan he figured prominently in that. So it's sort of tied together. Now, I was in Chicago prior to this, doing some guild work with Panthers and others, and mainly the Vietnam Veterans Against the War and the anti-war activists. So Sullivan was very active there. And when I moved back to Chicago, or from Chicago to Colorado, I think a lot of those investigations followed me. But that's just assumption for my part. In any event, prior to the revelation in the Freedom of Information document, it said all we had was the FBI's office involvement and unnamed faces in Washington rather than actual participants. Now, that is what was significant, because it came out with this particular names of the agents in Washington, D.C., such as Hoover, Sullivan, and Moore. They also had an informer named William O'Neill, who gave him a diagram of the apartment to his case agent. And what happened? They had led the raid, were able to kill a bunch of black people, scare the hell out of a bunch of black militants, and give Hoover a chance to pat himself on the back about keeping the blacks in line and keeping those revolutionaries in line. And that is how the whole thing developed. So Gary would not let his people testify. Branch couldn't indict Hanrahan, and everything was sort of pushed under the table, which was one of the trademarks of the Nixon-Agnew administration era anyway. So this goes back a long way, and it has relevance today, because it's the same shit that's going on with the Black People Matter, Black Lives Matter thing. They have not considered that black lives have mattered, at least to my experience, and not knowledge, but experience, since 1969, and I suspect it was long either. That was the case even before that. For instance, Colorado, back in the 30s and 40s, were big Klan state activity centers. They were active. The Klan was active. Later on, it was a focus on the communists, but then Hoover moved it around where the communists also funded the black revolutionaries and things like this. So rather than check into what factors caused this, the FBI and others took a very hard-handed view of suppression, because they didn't give a damn about causation. They just wanted it stopped. They didn't want to make any changes for the benefit of anyone. They had their own little bailiwick, and that was it. Sort of like what happened in a lot of the criminology and criminal justice seminars in the 60s, when they put graduate students in institutions. One such student appeared in an institution in Colorado on an internship, and he had a bunch of great ideas, and he got resistance by the guard, and nothing happened. No changes were made. The guard's attitude is, I've done this job for several years. My father did the job, and my grandfather did the job, and we don't want some punk student kid working on a graduate degree coming in here and telling us what to do. So they all laid low until the semester was up, and in the meantime they would pay lip service to some changes, but it still became business as usual. And that's why a lot of this stuff doesn't change. Why the Black Lives Matter hasn't changed much. Why they're still losing triangle hold on black victims and still harassing them and things like this. It's institutionalized, and until we change the institution and the makeup of the institution and the corporate culture of these institutions, we're not going to have any real change whatsoever. And I thank you for listening. Bye.